Good morning. This is a reading from the Gospel according to Mark. And it came to pass in those days that Jesus came from Nazareth in Galilee and was baptized in the Jordan by John. And as he was coming up out of the water, he immediately saw the heavens being ripped apart and the Spirit like a dove descending on him. And a voice came out of the heavens, "You are my beloved Son, in you I have taken delight." And immediately the Spirit cast him out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness 40 days, being tested by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and the angels were serving him. The Gospel of the Lord. We've been sitting with this reading for the past, this will be our 5th week, letting it be the scriptural, spiritual inspiration for our entry into the lives of the desert mothers and fathers. But in a way, the lives of the desert fathers and mothers are a commentary on this scripture. That is, Jesus himself is the first of the desert mothers, of the desert fathers, doing it perfectly, as it were, hearing this voice first, "You are my beloved Son," a voice that we know as good Nicene Christians. He's been hearing this voice for all eternity. The Son hears the Father's love and is sent by the Father and the Spirit. But here we have this movement of an eternal God taking on human flesh, and with this human flesh going out to hear this voice in a new key. It's one thing for the eternal Father to speak to the eternal Son, unto ages and ages, amen. It's another for Adam, exiled from paradise, to hear this voice again. And in Paul's theology, we are all that Adam, exiled from paradise, seeking to hear this voice saying, "You are my beloved child. I am well pleased in you." To hear the voice and to see reality match it. To hear, "You are my beloved," and also to know that we are pleasing, that we are good, to know that in our bodies as well as in our souls. So as you've been sitting with this and letting the lives of these 3rd, 4th, 5th century men and women help us to understand our own theology, what are you going to take away when you encounter this passage? Anyone have any insights? So we wrap up this week. Mary Jo.
For the first time, because I've been hearing the passage every week that you've been studying it, it's like I feel I'm living truly in the wilderness with the shooting earlier this week, the murders and the wild beast, and just living in this wilderness, being tested and still calling to God.
Yeah. I think in a real way, these men and women who went out into the desert went because that allowed them to see more clearly what humans are and what we could be. That is, in the city, we have ways of hiding ourselves, our thoughts, our appetites, our desires to manipulate and control. The desert isn't any different. Things are just clearer there. And I think events like this week's show us what is not new, but what we often overlook. And it makes it real for us. But of course, these events have been real for people before us, and they'll go on being real for people after us. Now maybe we can be in solidarity a little bit more. Other thoughts on the passage, other ways of reading that you maybe hadn't encountered or that you'll carry with you? Yeah.
The very last line, I always pictured Jesus out there, or now that we've learned the Desert Fathers out there, and within themselves struggling and having the Spirit. But I love the part and the angels were serving him, or the angels were working with them as they worked through.
Yes.
They're not alone.
Yes.
I always just grew up hearing and picturing them alone, and I love to know that they're not.
Yes. And the word for serving here is the same root from which we get deacon, diakonoi, to serve, which has overtones of, first of all, table service. That is people who bring you food. In this sense, we could see Jesus being fed by the food of the angels, which would remind us of Moses in the desert, the sort of angelic food. But also, whatever it is that we can feed on when we don't have food. Things like joy, peace, these fruits of the Spirit that alone seem to suffice even if we don't have enough. This is angelic food, and it's the work of the Desert Fathers and Mothers to go and try to discern, to sort of whet their appetite, because, brutes and gluttons that we are, we can't tell the difference between angelic food and maybe demonic food, so to speak. I can't tell the difference between gossiping about a worker and the kind of warm glow that gives me and finding something nice to say about someone. Maybe they feel the same to me until I begin to practice. And then all of a sudden, I lose my appetite for certain kinds of soul food. Certain things don't feed me anymore. Maybe they even make me sick. But other things do feed me. Maybe just a thought of gratitude, or seeing warmth in someone's face. Yeah, Jim.
It is certainly, you are my beloved. I have taken delight. The passion in those words.
Yes, yes. And that is what seems to feed Jesus. It's no accident that these two things are linked. He hears this voice. His body hears it. His body responds to this baptism, this plunging into watery death, and this coming out of the death into life. We know that this is true from eternity, but what does it mean for a human to experience this, to hear this voice, and then be sent into the desert to see if it works, to see if God is still there, to see if we can still be God's beloved in a situation like this? And so I think in many ways, Jesus never leaves the desert until Sunday, this coming Sunday. He'll leave the environment, but will he leave the place where there are wild beasts and temptations and the possibility of angelic food? I don't think so. I think this is just a symbol, not just a symbol. This is a symbol for what he will be doing for the rest of his life. There are lots of deserts, and he's going to go there. In fact, in Mark's gospel, he rarely goes into towns at all. He's always in the countryside, and there are reasons for that. But I think this is what the Son comes to do. He comes to be in our desert, because we've made Eden into a desert. And he helps us be fed. He helps us survive. All right. So this is always the hardest, because this is when I really realize how little we've talked about how much there is here. So I'm already mourning that this is the last week. We're going to spend a good chunk of our time talking about these thoughts that I introduced last week. We kind of looked at them from a general point of view, and I'll review a little bit of that. And then we're going to talk about some of these 8 deadly ways of mindless thinking that grow in us like poisonous fruit and ultimately will burst with venom instead of nectar. And then we'll take a little bit of time at the end just to sort of recap, to kind of gather our insights and thoughts so that we can walk away feeling like we have 1 or 2 nuggets of wisdom to chew on. Last week we talked about 3 renunciations that these 2 systematic thinkers who also practiced, who were also monks, but because of their training wanted to think about things in a little bit more refined ways. John Cassian, who has a feast day, at least in the East, and his teacher Evagrius, who does not have a feast day because for a long time he was considered a heretic, and has only recently been rehabilitated as maybe not as bad as everyone thought. I think he's phenomenal. But these 2 sort of systematize the life of the monk or the life of the one who seeks her or his heart's desire, not knowing exactly what that is, but giving it the name God and doing whatever necessary to find it. These 3 renunciations that they thought were necessary and sort of in order to find God both within and without. We find that distinction collapses the further into the spiritual life. The first is the renunciation of our former way of life. And the basic image of this is the one that we've been sitting with for the past 5 weeks. Someone leaves their village and goes and lives alone, right? And so I think in week 3, we imagine together what it would be like for sons, granddaughters, friends, cousins to leave Nashville and go settle on the outskirts in a burnt out trailer seeking God. And that's kind of an image we can carry with us. They're not too far away, but they're far enough that we're not going to go visit them regularly. And so the first step is they have renounced, they have cut ties with the way that they have been living. Their relationships are still there, but the usual patterns and habits of life aren't there anymore. And the Desert Fathers and Mothers thought that if you don't do this in some way, and we can be creative and maybe think of ways that we can do this in daily life, but unless we cut ties with our actual physical pattern of life, we're going to have a real hard time figuring out what is helpful and what is harmful in the spiritual life. It's really hard to have a vacation at home. You can try, and you can call it things like staycation, but it's really, really hard. You can't get away enough. And if you're trying to discern the voice of God, but you've grown up in a world that's sort of been created in order to help us not hear that, in which hearing the voice of God may be contrary to our interests in the acquisition of wealth, the pursuit of pleasure, the inflation of the ego, the things that people spend their time doing. Hearing the voice of God is very disruptive to that. So we create entire social orders that prevent us from having to hear it except in very controlled environments where we can walk away and not deal with it anymore. This first renunciation is saying, nope, we're getting rid of everything except for the stuff that sparks joy. Right. Thanks, Marie Kondo. We're going to give up everything to kind of test and see what's good. It's like, what do you call those diets, like the Whole30, where you eliminate certain kinds of foods for a while and then gradually bring them back in, first of all, to let your guts kind of heal, and then second of all, to sort of test things and say, okay, is it gluten? Is it sugar? Is it caffeine? Dear God, is it chocolate? What's going to happen? In a way, that's that these monks go into the desert to let go of everything, and then gradually maybe they'll reintroduce some things. But as one desert father said, I went to the marketplace to sell my goods, and when I saw anger approaching, I fled. It's too soon. Can't do it. Renouncing our former way of life creates space, creates silence, creates stillness, creates a place where all the stuff that was going on before is no longer happening. And so then we can expect, okay, we've quit our job, we've moved far away, we have the bare minimum of essentials, we're going to deal with the hunger, but now I can actually hear the voice of God, right? It'll come through loud and clear. Well, what we find when we follow Abba Moses' direction to go to ourselves so that we can be taught is that there's still a lot of noise. This is where we sort of picked up on last week. The noise doesn't come from without, it comes from within. And we find just how noisy our internal lives are. And we can begin to do this in daily life. If you practice any kind of silent prayer, any kind of meditation practice, and this spans traditions, sort of the first hurdle is, oh my gosh, my mind is uncontrollable. The Buddhists call it monkey mind. My thoughts leap from tree to tree, and I can't control them. And if I try to chase them down, they just, get out of my grasp. And there are all kinds of, bad ways of dealing with this, meaning we can try to quiet our minds. That doesn't seem to work very well for most people. We can try to conjure up different images to meditate on or think about. It depends on our goals. But the point is, we have these thoughts, and as we talked about last week, our thoughts are mindless. Anyone remember from last week's conversation, what makes a thought mindless? Why are we using this phrase, mindless thoughts?
Just floating in from any direction.
Yeah. I'm not thinking, I am being thought in. Thoughts happen, right? And that's generally our experience. We can direct our thought if we're solving a problem at work, if we're thinking about what we're going to make for dinner. We can give our thoughts direction, usually by dangling something juicy in front of them, like dinner, or dangling something that we really don't want, like getting fired in front of them. Then we can really control our thoughts. But when there's nothing dangling, our thoughts just happen. They seem to come from nowhere. They can come from outside. Someone can say something and I can have a stream of associations that goes from what they said to something really random. But we don't need external stimuli for thoughts just to happen. But when we begin to pay attention to our mindless thoughts, we find that maybe there is mind there after all. It just ain't ours. Maybe there is a kind of rationality, a kind of directionality to our thoughts, but it's not one that we like. And so we find that certain thoughts, if given attention, grow into desires. And those desires, if given attention, turn into habitual stories we tell ourselves about the way the world is and what we need and what we want. And if we pay attention to those stories, we find ourselves doing things we never thought we would, or not doing things for a long time, having wished we could have done them. We find ourselves living a life that we're not fully in control of, but it's no one else's responsibility. We've just let ourselves be populated by mindless thoughts. And the key is, it's not our mind doing the thinking. And that opens the door to all kinds of speculation and mythology and fun discussion of angels and demons and just whose minds are doing these kinds of thinking. And the Desert Fathers and Mothers thought a lot about that. And they did have sort of rich tapestries of stories and magic and demons, and that's all fun. And it's also all grist for the mill. And so this practice develops of watching our thoughts and really getting to know them, almost like an anthropologist looking inwardly and getting to know how often thoughts happen and where they tend to go. Evagrius asks us to observe their intensity. Is this a powerful thought, or is this a really gentle, delicate thought? Do they rise and do they fall? Are they complex or are they simple? How often do they happen? And then he gets into the demon stuff. That is, can we categorize these things? Can we create a taxonomy of thoughts, looking for a kind of rationality to them that's not our mind? We could substitute demon in some ways for, we could say disembodied spirits, or you could say like disembodied thought, which is what the Desert Fathers and Mothers kind of considered demons to be, sort of thought forms that try to reproduce themselves within people. I had a photo last week of cordyceps, which is a fungus that gets in living creatures, small living creatures like ants and wasps, and eventually populates itself and doesn't kill them. It just directs them to go where will best serve the fungus in its own efforts to reproduce. Demons in the lives or the minds of the Desert Fathers and Mothers are kind of like this. They just want to reproduce themselves. Anger wants to reproduce anger. Lust wants to reproduce lust. And in a way, it's kind of mindless. But there's a directionality to it. And so Evagrius and his student John Cashin develop a taxonomy that is meant to help us organize our thoughts. That is, to pay attention to the kinds of thoughts that we have and to note, okay, how often do I have these kinds of thoughts? Do these kinds of thoughts lead to other kinds of thoughts? Are there relationships here? And this is not meant to be, this is a map, right? When you have a map of a particular territory, especially when it's sort of hand-drawn by someone who's only been there once. You have to fill in the blanks, and you may find that the landscape has changed since that person has been there. It doesn't happen often anymore, but I remember the days of early Google Maps or GPS navigation where, if there was a new road, it wouldn't be updated for years. So you really still had to pay attention to the world around you, even if you were following GPS, because it wasn't updated all that regularly. Google has us covered now. I think you could create a new road and they'll have it mapped within a matter of hours. So as we go on to talk about these thoughts, this is a tentative probing. These desert fathers and mothers, in a sense, were experts at the landscape of their thoughts, as these thoughts were created in late antiquity. But our pattern of thinking, the thoughts that we think, their sort of color, their hue, their intensity, that all has a really complicated relationship with culture, with how we're raised, with the values that are given to us, with the way that our bodies are sort of primed to respond to particular sensory stimulation or not. And so this is a tentative map for us. This is more than 1,000 years old. It still proves remarkably helpful, but we should all feel a lot of permission to play with these ideas and to see what they're doing. They're creating general categories of thought to help them sort of track inner landscape stuff. But only you have access to your inner landscape, to your mental thought world. Only you have access to that. And maybe your therapist, but only through you, and sort of through how therapists see the outside and the inside. So this is something that if we don't take responsibility for it, for our own inner landscapes, if we don't take the time to find out just what's going on in here, no one else will do it for us. And God won't do it for us except by inviting us to kind of do this inner work. And some people can go their whole lives without needing to do a whole lot of inner work. Other people are invited into it very early on by having experiences that say, if I don't figure out what's going on here, if I keep feeling this way, I will not be able to keep living in the way that I want to. So there's a lot of overlap and resonance with modern psychology, with modern therapeutic modalities, things like that, as we think about trying to get to know ourselves and trying to discern where God is and to try to hear God's voice in the midst of thoughts, patterns of thinking. So we're going to talk for a little bit, time's almost half gone, about these 8 deadly thoughts. John Cashin and Evagrius's taxonomy. These are not the 7 deadly sins, right? The 7 deadly sins will come later. First, I think Gregory the Great, Pope Gregory, was the first one to sort of create a version of this called the 7 capital sins, where he took out vainglory and kind of morphed vainglory and sadness into envy. And so you get these 7, which then later people like Dante will use to organize purgatory and hell. But also the shift that's really important for our history as Catholics is that there is a shift from thoughts to these small seeds that over time will grow into ways of seeing the world, ways of experiencing other people, ways of experiencing ourselves that really limit the scope of our perspective. If I see the world through my stomach, I'm only going to be interested in what you can make me for dinner. If I see the world through my wallet, I'm only interested in you if you are an asset to my money-making scheme. Instead, this later focus is on actions. What have you done? Don't tell me that you're an angry person. Tell me about the angry things that you have done. And so for Catholics, we are obliged to confess actions, right, in the confessional. We could maybe confess some thought patterns, but usually a confessor is going to be very interested in not just thought, but in where it plays out. That's valuable, but it's very different from this tradition, which is about noticing tendencies. And many confessors don't have the patience to hear, us talk ad nauseum about our sadness. So this is not confessional. This is not for sacramental reconciliation. That might come at a different point. This is, again, for getting to know ourselves and our habits and seeing what sorts of plants are growing within our internal ecology. So some of these words we're familiar with. Some of them we're not. So I've taken the liberty of creating some helpful translations. There's really just looking at a thesaurus and picking words that resonated better with me and with the way that I'm going to present these. Avarice is fancy for greed. I mean, that's a pretty straightforward. You could also say acquisitiveness. Sadness is an interesting one, and we'll talk about it. But throughout the Desert Fathers, there's a praise of compunction, of a certain kind of sadness that leads people to really come to terms with what they've made of their lives. And against the context of God's abundant mercy, to weep for joy, having the opportunity to sort of start over again, or just to keep going. And they really liked this kind of sadness. This is the blessed are those who mourn kind of sadness. That's not deadly. So we'll have to distinguish between the kind of sadness that the addict feels when they hit rock bottom and begin to feel some hope that maybe they can get through this, and what I've chosen to translate is gloom or gloominess, like a funk or being down in the dumps, sort of self-reproducing miasma of sad that doesn't free us. And I think one of the keys about these thoughts is good thoughts free us. They create spaciousness in our mental and emotional landscapes. They make us feel light and free. Deadly thoughts weigh us down. They narrow our scope of feeling, of interacting, of thinking. Sloth is a really cute animal, and I'm sorry that we've decided to name a wonderful jungle animal after one of the deadly sins. And especially in our sort of post, this is a land settled partially by a tradition of Calvinism, a tradition of Reformed Christianity that, in a simplistic way said, God rewards those who work the hardest, both spiritually and materially, that we're here to work hard. And anyone who doesn't work hard is probably a sinner and probably, one of the reprobate, one of the damned. And that's how you can tell, one of the ways that you can tell the elect from the damned are lazy, right? They've lost hope. In sort of Catholic Mediterranean culture, we've escaped that. Laziness is built in. It's called the siesta, right? There's sort of in one of my favorite books, Nikos Kazantzakis' St. Francis, brother Leo, who's the narrator, praises laziness for having saved him, because otherwise he would have had to go to work and he never would have met Francis. So we're not talking about the desire not to work. We're talking about a sort of spiritual dullness, and I'll talk more about that, where life loses its savor. Vainglory is pretty straightforward, but sometimes we have to distinguish it from pride. Vainglory has to do with how we compare ourselves to others, whereas pride has to do with how we feel about ourselves. And so I've chosen to talk about vainglory as being a kind of self-absorption and pride as being a sort of superiority. So we're going to look at each of these. One way to look at these is that there is sort of a progression. And again, this is all tentative. Is there a progression? Only you can find out if there's a progression in your own life. But there's a sense in which we start with the simple ones in order to get into the more complicated ones. But that's because the more complicated ones are actually worse for us in some ways, create more obstacles to hearing God's voice than the simple ones. So Abba Isidore said, if you fast regularly, do not be inflated with pride. But if you think highly of yourself because of your fasting, then you'd better eat meat. It's better for a man to eat meat than to be inflated with pride and to glorify himself. So there's a kind of rank ordering here of what's more important and what's less important. Isidore thinks it's better to just be a normal person eating food and sort of being obsessed with food than it is to be obsessed with one's own self-importance. That one is deadlier. Now, eventually we have to figure out all of them. But we start with, and here's one way of categorizing these. We have mindless thoughts that have to do with craving, right? Wanting more of, wanting to acquire more of something, whether it's an experience or it's actual stuff. Then we have mindless thoughts that are kind of dealing with trying to avoid things that we don't want, whether those are relationships or harmful feelings, experiences we don't want. And then there's mindless thoughts that kind of are occupied with making an account of things, measuring things, figuring out how good, how bad. This is just one way of thinking about these things, and there are others. But we start with craving, and we think about that first renunciation. Leaving our way of life creates a context in which we can really get to know our cravings. You want to know whether you have a problem with gluttony? There's a really easy way. Anyone know what it is? Fasting. Go without food. See what happens. Take note of it. And this is a very different way of looking at it than often we do. Sometimes we think of fasting as like something that is good for us. We give up things and that kind of makes us spiritually better people. We don't always think about it as an experiment, right? As how much food is good for me to eat? How much food allows me to be the most spiritually alive and physically alive that I can be in? And you actually see this a lot in fitness culture. You know, people trying to sort of optimize their diets. Now, the Desert Fathers, when they look at craving and they look at gluttony especially, they're going to see gluttony as being a possibility, any kind of obsessing over food. So it's not necessarily eating too much, because this is about mindless thoughts reproducing themselves. It is possible to be a glutton and be the most abstemious eater ever. You're just eating your food very slowly and being very picky, and I couldn't possibly have more. So this is not, we all have patterns of thinking that tell us, okay, gluttons are just people who eat all the time. No, gluttons are people who think about food in mindless ways. That's it. Mindless thinking about food. And again, this is experimentation. How often do I think about food? Well, let's find out. Let's take away a little bit of it. Or maybe maybe that's not good for my health. What is? What if I give up salt for a week? Okay, that's interesting. And reintroduce things and find out what that happy medium is. And we have stories from the fathers saying, okay, yes, you can teach yourself not to eat for a long time. Maybe it's better just to eat a couple times a week or one meal a day, so that we're not thinking about food, right? We're not thinking about food, and we're not worried about it anymore. We have enough, and enough is enough. Any thoughts on gluttony?
John,
Yeah.
maybe I'm wrong, but I had the impression that people back then didn't really have a lot of food. And so it's hard for me to figure out what's the difference between gluttony and just trying to survive.
Part of that's a really good question, and you're right. There were, especially in Egypt, this was a place where if the Nile didn't flood at the right time, people starved. So there was a lot of attention to agriculture and a lot of attention to food. So part of this had to do with simply being able to survive in the desert, right? So part of fasting was, you learned the experimentation part, especially if you were from a wealthy family and this was new to you. But a lot of it was, how little can I survive on so that I don't have to go to the marketplace and sell stuff? And there was very much a sort of spiritual competitiveness among monks about how much they could fast, and a little bit of boasting, like I went 7 days and didn't eat anything. Well, I went 9 days. And there may be some kind of healthy camaraderie in that, and then the older monks would be like, kids, come on, let's not. So part of it was allowing, as we remember, one of our symbols for this is allowing the life of baptism to actually be real for us, right? So they saw Jesus as someone who, because he was saturated by the Spirit, could go into the desert and not need food because God was feeding him. And so the ability to survive on very little was also sort of testing, in a way, the Spirit. In a good way, like finding ways to feed on God where we just didn't need it enough. And that was absolutely necessary if you're going to live in a place without food. But it is a very different context from ours, where there's food readily available, and we're not talking about poverty levels of hunger. Now, in plenty of poor places, where there's not a whole lot of variety of food, that's still the occasion for obsessing over it, especially the delicacies that might be available. When are we going to butcher the lamb? We only have one. There are ways in which, you could imagine a village obsessing over that just as much as we would obsess over Pop-Tarts here. So it is about how often we're thinking about food. But when we're at starvation levels, this isn't the practice, right? The practice is something else. So fasting is sort of the first practice for a lot of spiritual writers. There's a saying that if you can control your stomach, then you can get to know everything else that's going on. But if you can't, then you're going to have a hard time discerning some of the more subtle aspects of the soul. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but it's true for some of these folks. Lust, I'm not going to talk too much about because it's sort of self-evident. We know that the context for a lot of these desert mothers and fathers was no sex. We're not doing any of that. And so they had to figure out what celibacy meant for them. In our context, those of us who have relationships in which sex can be sort of healthy and mutual, it's harder to read this aspect of the literature because it's written by and for celibates. So we have to do a whole lot of imaginative rereadings. And actually, one of my favorite writers in this, who's also a celibate, Mary Margaret Funk, she has found that the literature from India is actually really helpful. They have their own tradition of renunciation, but in a Hindu context, in certain traditions, celibacy is expected of everyone at some point in their lives, just as being a householder or raising a family is expected. So you sort of ascend through these seasons of life and have to deal with it. And regardless, she says, at some point everyone has to deal with celibacy. All of us are going to have to deal with not having ready access to sex. So that's a good time to sort of figure out where the obsession is. We pay a lot of attention to this in our culture, and very little of it is sensible. So I don't have a lot to say about that today, other than to compare it to gluttony, right? How much is too much? Pay attention. And then greed. And this is really simple. The Desert Fathers and Mothers thought that ownership of things was an illusion. They thought that whatever it means for humans to say that they own something is mostly a story we're telling about ourselves. And their reasoning was simple. We die. What could it mean for me to own something other than I have temporary use of it? Moreover, if everything created is created by God for our good and for our use, what can I say? How can I say I own something when God clearly owns everything and I have very little control over my own life, let alone my possessions? And so renouncing the illusion of ownership, of how we feel about things and feeling like something is mine. Renouncing this is a really important step in the life of the Desert Father and Mother. First of all, because they don't have many possessions, but that means the ones that they do have could require kind of a magical, almost a fetish-like feeling. There's stories of monks who are sort of hoarding books or tools or things, and they acquire an almost magical significance because it's theirs. They have something. But the Desert Father and Mother is also on a journey to finding that we don't even own ourselves, right? We don't have control over what or who we are. the whole idea of ownership sort of fades away in favor of what God seems to do, which is share, right? A kind of communal ownership or a sharing according to reason, that is, according to what people need. And so greed, it points to the way that we have a tendency to form personal attachments to things and the way that attachment feeds us, and whether that's good or bad. And there are lots of sayings in the Desert Fathers. They just don't have a lot of patience for ownership, because they see once you begin acquiring things, then there's never enough. You either have nothing or not enough. And so even later, when communities of monks sort of systematize this and codify it into something like the rule of St. Benedict, the whole house owns everything. Individual monks don't own anything. Individual monks, if they receive a gift, have to share it with the community. And so the abbot determines who gets to hold things, who gets which books, and every monastery does this differently. But the sense is that they don't own anything. Nothing is mine. They're simply what is ours. So if ownership is an illusion of the mind, if it's a story I'm telling myself about my relationship to a particular thing, then greed is a story I tell myself about what I need in order to be happy or fulfilled. And it's sort of this open-ended illusion. The answer is just more. That's how greed works. It's the story I tell myself about needing more of anything. It's the story I tell myself of having not enough. And we're not talking, again, about poverty levels of basic living. We're talking about the impulse to have more of an experience. For some of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, greed was the sin of Adam and Eve. And it's a delightful story, because you can actually tell the Genesis story about, or the garden story about any of the deadly sins, and it kind of works well. And I think we should. But the greed one is interesting, that they were greedy for something, even though they had enough. In daily life, I think one of the better contexts for practicing this is the family, or whatever. If we don't live alone, if we live in common with anybody, beginning to practice ours and renouncing mine. What does it mean to say that we have these things for our good, but I don't have my things? Now, some of my things I'm not going to let my children touch, because they won't use our things well. But this is something that I think is an entry point into thinking about life in the way that the Desert Fathers and Mothers do. What if ownership is an illusion? Useful at times, but what if it is a story we tell ourselves about our relationship to things that has as its goal reproducing a certain kind of experience that may not eventually be good for us, especially when we know that we don't get to keep anything. Not a thing. All right, I'm just going to name the rest. We could probably spend easily a session on each of these, and it would be probably really fruitful. Instead, we get a minute or two. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, anger drove a lot of the Desert Fathers and Mothers into the desert. Relationships that were unsatisfying, frustrating, had bred resentment and bitterness. And so a lot of the sayings are about anger and about how it distorts. And really, the Desert Fathers and Mothers are thinking about obsessive anger, not just flashes of rage, but the kind of persistent thinking about other people in situations that we don't like that narrows our focus. And when we think about a time when that we've been angry, it's not hard to see that if we act in the midst of those high emotions and being sort of bombarded by sensory stimuli, it's very difficult to make good decisions when we're angry. We can make snap decisions, but it's very difficult to make careful decisions. Anger is loud. It's internally a loud emotion. It blots out more subtle things. And so the monk saw anger as sort of following from the previous three, when we are not getting what our internal stories are telling us we should have, then we get angry, right? We can get angry about food. Has anyone seen anyone in a restaurant get angry about food? Yeah. We can get angry about lust. People talk as though they have a right to sexual intimacy, as though someone else's body belongs to them, and if they don't get what they need, then they get angry. I mean, this is language that people use that is an interesting story to tell, and if we tell it loud enough, we begin to believe that it's true, but no one ever died from lack of sex. So we can get angry about relationships and not feeling enough pleasure, and pleasure is a good. We do need pleasure. And we can get angry about not having what we want in terms of greed, not having the right possessions. We can get angry at our lives for not having enough. So anger is sort of the gateway to the sort of secondary or the next tier up of dealing with the internal thoughts. Because anger tells us that our stories are misfiring. Anger tells us that our stories are trying to get us to live in a reality that's not right. They don't talk about healthy anger. The Desert Fathers and Mothers really don't think there is any healthy anger. That's something I think we could push back on. But having read lots of folks in the nonviolence movement, from people like Thich Nhat Hanh to Thomas Merton to more recent activists, anger can be a good motivator for thought and for careful planning. But anger alone will not bring about justice, right? When we are angry, it's actually really hard to tell the difference between what is just and what I want. It's only when anger dissipates that we can kind of look clearly. So I tend to see anger as a red flag, as a look, some boundary is being crossed that allows us to say, is this a good boundary or not? Have you crossed the boundary because you took away my plate too early, or have you crossed a boundary that actually matters? We then get into bitterness and dullness, and I'm going to speed up here so we can get done. Anger sort of develops, according to the fathers and mothers, into what they would call sadness. But again, this is a really murky, heavy, I like bitterness or gloom, where we just can't stop telling ourselves the story about how bad our lives are. We could begin talking about depression, though that gets really complicated. They didn't have any sense of sorts of brain chemistry or sort of how our bodies affect our minds in ways that we would sort of make sense of. So I'm very careful about saying depression is a deadly thought. But anyone who has suffered from depression does see how it is kind of a deadly thought. We can't blame the victim always, but there are thoughts that have to be dealt with if we are going to get out of this sort of sunken, bitter place. And it's a place where we kind of gnaw at ourselves and we almost don't want to let go of sadness or bitterness or frustration or gloom. And eventually that can give rise to what the Desert Fathers and Mothers called acedia, which is super complicated, and it's less a mood and more a dissatisfaction with life. A monk could be doing quite well indeed, actually, and all of a sudden she can't tolerate her own cell. She becomes a busybody. She's always getting in people's business. She doesn't want to be in silence. She needs something to do. Life, the spiritual life, the things that are on the horizon seem to be detestable. And if you've ever experienced acedia, first of all, it only affects people who are sort of into the spiritual life. Just like the 7-year itch only affects people who have been married for 7 years or some length of time. There are other kinds of things like it, but until you've been in a relationship that is sort of settled and there's lots of good in it, but it's not the same, you can't have a 7-year itch. Acedia is like the 7-year itch of the spiritual life, where like you're doing well, but things begin to lose their savor. And on the one hand, this is a way of learning how to survive on less, right? Letting go of ways that maybe stories that we've been telling ourselves that were sort of feeding our ego in certain ways. But it makes life really dull. It makes it really hard to be motivated. What we're not talking about here are all the ways to combat this or deal with it that would require its own sort of series, which maybe we can do. And then finally, the two worst kinds of things. Self-absorption or vainglory, sort of obsessing over how one compares to others, and superiority, truly thinking that I have accomplished anything on my own. Sort of that warm glow of self-satisfaction that is not self-esteem, but sort of sets me apart. The refusal to be ordinary, and the dissatisfaction with anything other than perfection would be something like pride. So the point of the work is not to become perfect. Or rather, let me say, the point of the work is not to make ourselves perfect. That is God's job. The point of the work is to get to know ourselves and to get to know our tendencies and to make little micro adjustments to help us to be hopefully easier to get along with, more gentle, more patient, more available would be the best word. Our obsessions, our obsessive thoughts, our mindless thoughts can decrease our available energy to others, decrease our attention. And I don't just mean in terms of time. We just get caught up in stuff. And by getting to know our landscapes, we can say, oh, that's this. I'm not going to feed it. And now I'm available to other people. And so the point isn't to get rid of these things. It's to get to know them. It's to live with the wild beasts. Right? So Abba Anthony says, whoever has not experienced temptation cannot enter into the kingdom of heaven. Without temptations, no one can be saved. Because we are saved through these experiences, not from them. Abba Poman said of Abba John the Dwarf that he'd prayed to God, John the Dwarf prayed to God to take his passions away from him so he might be free from care. Just let me bliss out. Poman went and told an old man this. John the Dwarf went and said, I find myself in peace without an enemy. And the elder said, go beseech God to stir up warfare so that you may regain the affliction and humility that you used to have. For it is by warfare that the soul makes progress. So the goal here is not sort of peaceful equanimity. That's not what we're seeking. In fact, trying to cling to that is another story we're telling ourselves. It is humility. It is being in it with one another. That this tradition says is what holiness really is. Other religious traditions will not say that, and we could put those in dialogue. Okay. The next series, after we did all the thoughts, would be about renouncing our images of God. We're not going to talk about that now, but that's the next renunciation. And you can't do that until you've figured out the difference between your thoughts and God. I have one handout here that begins to get into that. It's from one of my favorite books called Into the Silent Land. It's about the life of contemplation. But I'll leave you with this. Remember, Abba Anthony was the granddaddy of all desert fathers and mothers. He did it all. He lived to 106 and died a carefree, humble, friendly monk who had lived alone in the desert. It was revealed to Abba Anthony in his desert that there was one who was his equal in the city. He was a doctor by profession, and whatever he had beyond his needs he gave to the poor. And every day he sang the Sanctus with the angels. So this is not just about going to our burnt-out trailer, right? This is possible to us. All through renunciations, getting to know our inner ecology, getting to know what feeds us, and eventually hearing the voice of God in the silence that we find in our hearts, in moments at times, and then series of moments. This is all possible. It is possible to experience spiritual joy, to feed on it, and to be available to others. It's very possible. We need community. We need time. But we need very little else to do it. So hopefully this series has whet your appetite, at least, for what's possible. Not everyone's tradition is this. Not everyone's practice is directly informed by this. But even if it just expands your imaginations into what we are capable of, we normal lay people in the midst of life, because all these folks, they were just normal lay people who wanted more out of life. This tradition is alive and well in small pockets and small streams of literature, but men and women continue to try to live out according to this wisdom and modifying it and adapting it as necessary. So if you're interested, I love talking about this stuff as is clear. I'm happy to talk more. If you have a small group and you want materials to think through these things, I'm happy to do that. I can lead retreats. So I don't know when we'll get back to this in this context, but know that this is something that is there, and if it's interesting to you, I'm happy to talk and provide more. Good? Okay. Well, until next time. Yeah, John.
Just kind of thinking, is the organized church talking about these virtues and potential, in what way would we see this?
That's a great question. So John is asking how the organized church has inherited this. It's kind of a specialty. I mean, it's kind of a strand of tradition, or maybe a tradition within the traditions. Most of the organized church, we're coming out of a period that assumed that it was the business of monks, nuns, and priests to be this kind of holy, right? They're living according to the gospel precepts, the perfect life where they have taken vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. And so this is possible to them. A lip service is paid to the possibility of like an ordinary holy life. But there's not a lot of practical help. And it's just the assumption that this isn't, that the sort of joyful life of spiritual freedom isn't for us yet, us being lay people. We're coming out of this tradition, but for a long time, our job was to pray, pay, and obey. But yes, and have children. Right, have children who could, some of them, go on and do this. So there's not, in our canonized saints, most of them are single, right? Most of them are celibates. We don't have a lot of canonized married folks. Part of that is because married holiness, and I don't just mean married, but holiness in the world doesn't draw attention to itself like sometimes other forms of holiness can. But I don't find this talked about a lot. And I don't find that lots of representatives of the institutional church know a whole lot about prayer beyond sort of the beginnings. Find some time to do it and then try to do it. But what to do when you get there, that's as much a gift and a sort of specialization as anything else is. Just like not every priest is a great homilist or a great confessor, not every priest is equipped to talk about the life of prayer in these kinds of ways. And there are different traditions. I think probably the Jesuits and the Ignatian tradition has had much more of an effect on the spiritual teachings of the church than this. Where you will find this is in Eastern Orthodoxy, where these people are still read and on their calendars, and there are lots of good things for lay people to begin to practice. So that's where you would look for like an institutional response. But even in Orthodoxy, there's the sense that like monks and nuns are the ones who are really doing this work, which makes sense because they are. They have made the first renunciation overtly. Many of us come later to it. But I would love to see more. Most of it's in things like contemplative outreach, sort of para-church organizations that are trying to make this more well-known. And once you see this, you can find it places. You can see, centering prayer comes right out of this through a particular medieval tradition, and that's more popular than other things. Yeah.
You're saying being a tradition, the Eastern tradition. When we were going through this, I was thinking of some of my friends in the Islamic community and how much of this is their daily.
Oh yes, yeah, and especially like Sufi mysticism But there's an entire prayer tradition that comes from the same area, the same place, and through some of the same traditions. It's very philosophical in a way that this isn't. But there are some great conversations happening even now about scholars reading people like Cashin and Evagrius in an Islamic context. So absolutely. In fact, all of the world religions, to simplify things, have versions of this, of the problem of how do we get to know our thoughts and what do we do about them. The goals can be a little bit different, and the practices can be different, but the overlap and the interplay, I think the 60s and 70s were just a really fertile time when people like Thomas Merton, he was talking to Sufis and the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh. Everyone was sort of talking and discovering one another's traditions. And there was a sense of not having to leave one's own tradition in order to benefit from the richness of others. I think we've stepped more into, at least in a Catholic perspective, our walls are a little higher than they used to be. For a while they were coming down, and now we're like, well, is it really Catholic? It doesn't feel as safe. I don't know that's good for us, but it's where a lot of folks are, especially a lot of younger folks. All right, thank you all. Okay.